Hey y'all, it's Stacy. Welcome back to the kitchen. Today we are gonna make my chocolate chip pound cake. Now, if I tell you that I love a pound cake, I love a pound cake. And this chocolate chip pound cake is based on my buttermilk pound cake. And honestly, when it comes to pound cakes, those are probably my two favorite pound cake recipes. But now I will say this, you give me any pound cake and I'm gonna be happy with it, but this one, I don't know, there's just something special about it. To start, in my stand mixer here, I've got 1.5 cups or 3 sticks of unsalted butter. Now you can do this in a stand mixer or you can do this with a hand mixer. Just know that there's a little bit of effort that goes in here if you're gonna use a hand mixer. So a stand mixer certainly comes in clutch here for this recipe. Now, I said unsalted butter. The thing that we also need to do is we need to talk about why room temperature ingredients are important. The whole process of cake making, especially when it comes to things like pound cakes, there's a whole science behind the emulsification and the structure and all of these kinds of things. So it's important that we use room temperature ingredients because that emulsification is going to build a whole lot better and easier when we use room temperature ingredients. We want our butter to be room temperature, maybe slightly less than room temperature. We want it to be nice and soft, but not too soft. And I know that's kind of vague. But leave it out for about 30 minutes before you get started, and typically that will get you where you need to be. So, 1.5 cups of unsalted room temperature butter. To that, I'm going to add 2.5 cups of regular granulated sugar right into the mixer here. And we're going to cream these together. We're going to start that emulsification process. The thing is that you want to make sure that you really get this beaten really well together. This is going to take like 3 to 5 minutes. We want it to lighten in color, to fluff up, and so don't skip on this step. All right, after about 4 minutes at about medium-low speed, you can see that this mixture has lightened up so much. In fact, if you look really closely, you can see a little clump of what it looked like before. So that's when we started, and now you can see how it's lightened in color. It's light and fluffy now. This is what we're looking for. All right, next we're gonna add our eggs. Now with this creaming step, we really can't overbeat it. I mean, technically, if we went way beyond 5 minutes, we could, but we really want to get this light and fluffy, and that's going to take 3 to 5 minutes. But once we start adding our other ingredients, we literally want to mix it just enough to get it combined. If we add those eggs and we beat a bunch of air into it, what's going to happen is once it bakes and it starts to cool, those proteins from these eggs are going to contract. And if you've ever had a pound cake that you baked and as it cooled, it kind of shrunk and the top broke off of it, that's probably what happened is you overbeat the batter. So what we're going to do, this is 4 large room temperature eggs. We're going to add them one at a time and mix, like I said, just enough to get them combined. All right, now your mixture may look a little curdled at this point, but that's probably okay because it's going to come together once we add our other ingredients. As just a general fail-safe, what I'm going to do here is scrape down the sides of the bowl just to make sure that there's nothing that's stuck that's not getting mixed in. I like using the paddle blade here that has the silicone edge that kind of helps to scrape the bowl, but even still, it's great to pull out a spatula like this one or a spoonula. Give it a quick stir and then mix one more time just to make sure everything's nice and combined. All right, that's pretty well mixed together, so let's talk about our dry ingredients. In my bowl here, I've got 3.5 cups of all-purpose flour. Now, for this recipe, I recommend, and honestly with any baking recipe, if the recipe calls for a specific method in terms of how to measure the flour, you want to make sure that you follow that method. For all of my recipes, I use what I call the scoop and level method. We don't want to take our measuring cup and just jam it into a canister of flour. We're going to pack too much in there. So what I'll do is I will stir my flour in a large container, spoon it into my dry measuring, and then use maybe the back of a butter knife just to level that off. So that's what I've done to measure this flour. So this is 3.5 cups of all-purpose flour. To this, I'm going to add a 1/2 teaspoon of salt, and a half a teaspoon of baking soda. Now, I'll often get questions about adding salt to recipes and why did we use unsalted butter? Could we just use salted butter and not add the salt? The thing is that it's important to use unsalted butter in recipes like this because if we use salted butter, different brands use different amounts of salt in their salted butter. When we add the salt versus when we let somebody else add it, we have the control over that. Now, can you use salted butter and omit it? Probably, but it's best to stick with the recipe just to ensure that we're going to get the end product that we're hoping for. Now, I'm just going to whisk this together just a little bit just to get that baking soda and salt combined. And then we're going to start adding this to our batter here. I've also got 1 cup of whole buttermilk. When at the grocery store, you're likely to find low-fat buttermilk and whole buttermilk. If you're lucky, grab the whole buttermilk. Adding a little extra fat is not a problem in this case. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to break this up. We're going to kind of visually imagine that our bowl here of our dry ingredients in thirds. We're going to add 1/3 of the flour, then half of the milk, 1/3 of the flour, then half the milk, then the last third of the dry ingredients to make sure that we get everything nice and incorporated. And we're going to turn this all the way down to low because if we don't, we're going to end up with flour all over the kitchen, probably all over me too. That looks like that's about 1/3. And I'm going to add about half of our buttermilk here. Get that combined. Now we're going to add another 1/3 of our dry ingredients. Let that combine just a little bit, and then we're going to add the other half of our buttermilk. And then we've got our remaining 1/3 of flour, and I'm just going to dump this one in like this. And then I'm going to pause for a second because I want to scrape this down one more time. Because again, once we've added our flour here, we run the risk of mixing this too much and creating gluten, which is going to give us a really tough cake, not a light and fluffy one. So before this is all mixed all the way through, I'm just going to scrape down the sides just to make sure that we don't have any dry flour stuck to the side of our mixing bowl here. All right, that's nice and combined. Now we're going to add our extracts and our chocolate chips. Now I found that for this recipe, the perfect ratio, we're going to need about 1 tablespoon of extract. I'm doing 2 teaspoons of vanilla. Now look, I get questions all the time about should I be using an extract or a flavoring? Extracts obviously are more expensive. They're a premium product. And I recommend that if you're going to make something that doesn't have to be cooked, use a nicer extract or flavoring. If you're going to bake it, I say use the cheap stuff. Years ago, I read an article by somebody who was way smarter than me that explained the science behind this. And essentially, extracts, the nice stuff, is commonly made with alcohol. And we know that when alcohol and heat combine, that alcohol evaporates and kind of cooks out and often leaves you with a flat flavor. When we use an imitation vanilla, that flavor doesn't happen. That thing doesn't happen and that flavor stays in there. We tested it and we found that to be totally true. So when I can buy a giant bottle of imitation vanilla extract or imitation vanilla flavoring for $7 or a tiny one from 7, I'm almost always going to buy that big, less expensive one. Nobody's going to know. I'm going to add 1 teaspoon of almond. Now, a lot of people don't love almond. I will eat almond anything, so I love adding almond to this, and this gives it just a hint of flavor where you don't really know that it's almond, but it just gives it a really great flavor. And this is 1 10-ounce package of mini chocolate chips. I tested this recipe with both the mini chocolate chips and the big ones, and I found that the mini ones kind of spread throughout the batter and the cake better and didn't all sink to the bottom like the heavier ones. Could you use the other ones? Probably, but I found that the minis were the best option here. It's going to go right in, and we're just going to give this a quick spin just to get all that combined. I'm going to scrape it down one more time just to make sure that we don't have batter in the bottom of the bowl that doesn't have chocolate chips in it. And one more stir. And that looks pretty well combined. Now let's talk about our pan. You're gonna need a 10 to 12 cup pan for this. And whether you choose to use a traditional bundt pan, or I'm gonna use a really cool square pan today that I love the kind of vintage look of. But I wanna talk to you about this for just a second. So the kind of pan that you use and what that pan is made of is gonna have an effect on the bake time, the crust. For instance, a solid bundt pan like this one that's non-stick is probably gonna take about an hour to an hour and 15 minutes. You're gonna end up with a darker crust that's maybe a little bit thicker. This aluminum pan, which honestly in baking, I love aluminum because of the way that it conducts heat. And this one's cool because it's square. It's gonna take a little bit longer in the oven in this pan because of the way that it conducts heat. So just keep in mind that you're gonna wanna adjust that based on the kind of pan that you use. Let's also talk about how we're gonna prepare this pan. You've got a couple different options. You know your pan better than I know your pan, so I suggest that if you can get away with using something easy like baking spray that has flour in it, do that because it coats really well, and if it works, great, but it doesn't always work. You may have to use a more traditional method where you grease and flour your pan, or maybe even make some of those homemade goop recipes that combines things like vegetable oil and flour and then you can brush on your pan. Sometimes the only way to know that is trial and error. If you find that you have a pan that sticks, then you may need to try another method in terms of greasing and flouring it. I know that this pan performs beautifully with just this baking spray, so that's what I'm going to use today. I want to make sure that we get everything coated, and then we're going to add our batter. All right, I'm just scraping down the sides just one last time, just to make sure we've got everything combined. And this is going to go right into our prepared pan here. I'm going to spin the pan just a little bit. And as I said before, you want a pan that is roughly 10 to 12 cups just to make sure you've got enough space for this to rise in the oven. I've got my oven preheated to 325 degrees. And again, depending on the pan that you choose, your bake time may change a little bit. I know that in this aluminum pan, this is going to take about an hour and 20 minutes to an hour and 25 minutes. If you're using a traditional bundt pan, an hour and 10 to an hour and 15. But the thing is, still, depending on how your oven bakes, that's going to change a little bit. We're going to cook this until a toothpick inserted into the center comes out clean. And if you want to be technical, you can also temp a cake like you can temp meat, about 205, 208 degrees, keeping in mind that it's going to continue to cook as you pull it out of the oven. All right, after about an hour and a half in this aluminum pan, you can see that this is done. Again, depending on the exact pan that you're using, that's going to change a little bit. Like if I had used that other bundt pan, it probably would have taken about 10, 15 minutes less. I'm going to do the toothpick test here. What we're looking for is we want to be sure that when we stick a toothpick in the center of the cake, we pull that out, we have virtually no crumbs. A few like slightly moist crumbs are probably okay. Other visual cues, we want to make sure it's nice and golden brown. It might start pulling away from the edges a little bit, and that's an old school technique that we often use, but it's not always super reliable. The other thing that you can do too is you can temp a cake just like you can meat. We want this to be about 208 degrees. And we just hit 208, 209, so we know that we're cooked all the way through. If you've ever had a pound cake that when you sliced it, you kind of had that little dense section right in the center of the cross section of the cake, it's likely because it wasn't cooked all the way through. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna let this rest about 10 minutes. There's a sweet spot there because if we turn it out right now, it's so hot it's just gonna crumble apart. If we let it rest in the pan for too long, all that sugar that's in there is gonna harden and it's gonna stick to the pan and make the cake stick. So that sweet spot is about 10 minutes. We're gonna let this rest for about 10 minutes to cool, and then we're gonna turn it out. All right, after about 10 minutes, we're gonna turn this out onto a serving platter, and I've got one here that just happens to be square as well. I think that'll complement the square plate or the square cake pan. I'm just gonna put this right on top. And this pan is still a little warm, so I'm gonna use these just to flip this over. And in one quick motion, we're gonna try to flip this over. All right, I think that worked. And there you go. This cake is just perfect. There's something about that buttermilk that just gives it this rich, dense, almost tangy flavor, and it's perfectly complemented with those chocolate chips. You can find the full recipe and all my tips and tricks for making the perfect pound cake by heading over to the website at southernbite.com. You can just search for chocolate chip pound cake. Y'all enjoy.